quote again by Rabbi, what was his name? Rabbi Khan. Because we're going from this glory and this revelation at Mount Sinai, and then it flips right into very nuts and bolts, literally, description of how to build the Mishkan, the Tabernacle. And with Mishkan, for those of you who have not seen it in Hebrew, there it is transliterated. Shekan means to dwell. You've heard of the Shekhinah, the glory, the indwelling presence of Adonai. Well, when you put that mem on the front of the word, then it makes it a construct that kind of says, like menorah. Ner is going to be the heart of menorah. Ner means a candle or a light. When I say menorah, it's the means by which the light is accomplished. When I say Mishkan, then I'm saying, okay, this structure is the means by which that indwelling presence among Israel was accomplished. So the Mishkan, we've seen this presence on the mountain. Of course, then we had this horrible golden calf incident. So it tells you, the rabbis debate how far out of chronology this Torah portion is, because there's some shifting back and forth of verb tenses in Hebrew that may or may not be translated. Sometimes he will say, the things that I have shown you, and sometimes he will say the things that I will show you. You shall do this as a future tense, but then it's like, okay, but you've already seen this before. So there's a lot of shifting back and forth, and it seems to be a little bit like the Torah portion Yitro. Remember, we had all this information about Yitro, but we knew that it wasn't chronological. It just couldn't be. So basically he's saying, okay, most of the stuff I want you to know about Yitro, I'm going to put it in this crate and dump it in the Torah portion Yitro. And it's for you to unpack it later. Because he didn't think it was as important for us to know about Yitro chronologically as he did for us to know about Yitro thematically. What are we supposed to know about this person, Yitro? He puts that in a crate and drops it in front of us, says, now you unpack this as needed. And we're like, that's not the way we're used to reading. We're used to people unpacking it for us chronologically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like you did in the first chapter. Why are you doing this now? He's like, well, by now you're growing up, right? you're able to look at things in a different way. So Terumah, which can be translated a few different ways. It can mean you shall raise, like you shall raise a contribution. It can be like a gift that's offered up. At any rate, you need to see the essence of Terumah is going to be to rise. So are we talking about resurrection? Possibly, maybe hinting to it. But I think more probably it's giving us an opportunity to evaluate not just where we want to be in this life, in terms of our volunteerism, but where that would place us in the next life, in terms of volunteerism. Because Moses keeps being referred to something he's seen in spiritual places. He was in another zone when he saw what he saw. So he's got to now come back to earthlings and try to translate these lofty spiritual things that he's experienced to people, just us, trying to figure out what in the world did that garden look like? Because it's like these revolving round things going on in these rivers, but they're water, but they're fire. And we're trying to visualize, and then it's like your head wants to explode at some point. And so it's a good thing it only comes around once a year. And then you can explode your head at the same point next year. until finally things start dropping into the sockets, right? And in this Torah portion, you've got sockets. You've got beams that stand upright, but he's also made bases with sockets. So when that beam drops into place, it's going to fit there right. But who knows how many years we just dragged the board around and around and around the dust of the tabernacle trying to figure out how this board fits into the hole. It's interesting, though. I don't know if you've read through the portion yet, but it kind of goes backward in terms of what we see, and there's something left out, which is interesting. But he writes, the Mishkan was a vehicle for transforming the revelation at Sinai, which included the visions at the base of the mountain, as well as the covenant and the commandments that were transmitted on the summit into a permanent part of human experience. He says, the Mishkan was designed to take that singular experience of Sinai, to fuse it with Moses' unique vision, to make it tangible, so that we might raise ourselves up, aspire to, and achieve a more enlightened life here on earth. And that's pretty profound. That at this point, at Terumah, just to begin, it tells us that, okay, I have done all the work up to this point, is what the Holy One is saying. Okay, look, I destroyed the Egyptians for you. I brought you out of Egypt. I've given you bread. I've given you water. Your clothes aren't wearing out. I've taken care of every need that you have. But now I'm going to give you an opportunity to partner with me. And what happens next here? I'm going to give you an opportunity to decide, to make decisions on how much you want to elevate your spiritual life in this wilderness. And that's the decision we all have to make. We have this glorious experience. We might say this was our salvation experience where, this was the turning point of our lives. We realized that we were insufficient in ourselves. We were sinful in ourselves, and there was only one who was sufficient. We made that acknowledgement of Yeshua as salvation. But then from there, every one of us still has what we had in the garden. We have the power to decide what we're going to do with the life he gives us. He brought us out of Egypt. Now, what are we going to make of this life he gave us? What are we going to make of this salvation? We can't reproduce the salvation. That's not our job. But then he gives us a job, because he says in verse 25, he says, Hashem spoke to Moses saying, speak to the children of Israel, and they shall take to me a portion from every man, every person whose heart will motivate him. You shall take my portion. So there's two takings. And there's the taking that we already know about. He has taken them to be a people at Sinai. Isn't that part of the whole thing? I will take you. We go over that when we do the Passover Seder. I will take you. So he has taken them. But now he says, I'm giving it back to you. I want you to decide what portion you're going to take from what I've given you. And that's the key. He's already given them everything they have. He has given them the silver, the gold, the copper, the linen, the wool, the jewels. he has given them everything they have taken out of Egypt. The only question now is, he says, it's time to build a Mishkan. It's time to build a place, not because he needed the place for his presence. He didn't. He says, if you will build this, then I will dwell among them. The point was not to dwell in the tent. It was to dwell among the people. But it's somehow in bringing and in worshiping as one people, it brings them into a unity where he can dwell among them. And so the more separated, the more we fuss and fight, the more we go our own directions, then the more difficult it is for his presence to dwell among us. And that's particularly difficult for us, I think, because we are coming from so many different places. So we're definitely not in unity with the place we came from, but we've still not seen really the place we're going to. And so we're kind of in this limbo stage like they were in the wilderness. They still have not seen the place they're going to. Doesn't really matter. Because if you remember, they saw the temple at the Song of the Sea. Remember them singing? And they're referencing the fact that they have seen the place of his sanctuary. They've seen the mountain. And they're singing about Jerusalem before they have ever seen the place or know its name. So they saw the temple. In fact, there's a case to be made that when the elders went up and they ate on the mountain, remember it says, and they saw like a sapphire brickwork under his feet that resembled the throne. And when we talk about the third temple, that's not a Christian invention. It's something that Christianity took from Judaism, because there is a tradition within Judaism about the third temple. And it goes back to the prophecies that say that I'm going to lay your foundations in sapphire. That third temple, actually what they saw was a vision of what the third temple will be, which is really the heavenly temple. It's going to be a merging where that we are able to access what Moses saw. But here we get to choose. And so we can identify with the Israelites at this point. They're not in Egypt, but they're not in Israel. But they're the children of Israel. So can you be a child of Israel without being in Israel? Absolutely. And he made provision for us to be, a part of a nation without yet having a nation. And he says, I want you to take something. I want you to take to me a portion. Every one of you whose heart will motivate him, I want you to take my portion. And then, basically he's telling Moses, and then from them, take my portion. So he's not it's not like the half shekel, where everybody had to bring the silver for the ransom of your souls, basically. He says, this is not so much just a ransom, a basic ransom that's required of everyone. This is the portion that you choose for yourself. Now, if you'll remember later when you get the agricultural regulations and statutes and so forth, it tells you to leave the corners for the stranger, the alien, the orphan, and the widow. And what the rabbis point out is it never tells you how big those corners are supposed to be. That depends on the landowner. If you want to give much to the stranger, the alien, the orphan, and the widow, and basically when you give to them, you're giving to him, you can leave a lot of stuff, some big corners, you choose them, or if you'd rather not. You can leave smaller corners. It's entirely up to you. There is no rule or regulation that says how much you must leave in the corner any more than in Terumah there is any written requirement that tells you what you must give. In fact, it doesn't even tell you to give. It just says, if your heart motivates you, then take my portion. And a portion is something that you set aside. It becomes holy by virtue of what it is, because it is taken out of the whole and it is set aside and designated for a specific purpose. So we kind of get the idea now of terumah. But it says, the comment we have on this, it said it would seem that giving an offering would be a more appropriate expression than taking an offering. Never been to church, have they? They still take up offerings in church. Rashi explains that taking in this context means setting the offering aside before giving it to those who collect it, and thus it is an appropriate expression. So that's why there's two takings, because your heart is telling you what to set aside, and then when the one comes by who makes the collection, then it is taken again, that there's actually two portions. The idea here is that in raising terumah, to raise something up, by virtue of putting that choice in your heart, you get to decide how much you're going to invest of yourself and what he's given you in this life into the holy community. Because see, what you're doing is you're taking from your individual blessing, whether it's gold, silver, jewels, dye, yarn, sheep, goats, whatever it is you're giving, you get to choose how much you put into it. But what you put into it has a direct bearing on what is elevated. And we know that in the lower garden, that the lower garden is actually part of more than one heaven. We know that the lower garden, what did Paul call it? I think he called it the third heaven. So there's levels of the heavens. There might be 7 heavens. There might actually be 10 heavens. We're not really told exactly how many levels that there are. But in terms of what you choose to invest, as you're working on who you are, because see, these gifts represent you, your heart, how you want to grow, how you want to beautify the body of Messiah. And so the more you invest into that kingdom, and we're not talking about writing big checks. I mean, it could be. We're not counting money out. But truly, I mean, this is such a personal thing, because he says it's what your heart motivates you to do. There's things that he will demand of you. There are things that he will do for you that you can't do for yourself. But in this particular matter, and bringing in the raw material of the Mishkan, because see, here's the thing about the Mishkan. They didn't assemble it as they went. You notice that? It was not assembled as they went. It was not elevated. Specific Hebrew word that talks about when they, like when they erected the tabernacle. That was not done on a as-you-go basis. It was more resemble probably a barn raising where everything's going to be accomplished on the same day. But up until that time, everything is worked on independently until it's all ready to be put together at one time. But if you'll notice in the portion where it starts out, and I guess with tomorrow's class, what I wanted to do tonight was actually just go step by step through the tabernacle. How many of you have done that in your heads? Just going through the Torah portion, tried to envision, and I know the measurements will just blow your mind. But I even, to help, I brought a tape measure. And it's not cubits. Remember, it's our old measurement that helps us define the distance we can walk on Shabbat, which is an amah, and the plural is amot. Well, these measurements we're getting in the Torah portion are in amot. And so they're estimating the amah to be somewhere between 19 and 22 inches. So let's just say it's 20 inches. That would be an amah. And so when we get to the Mizbeach, when we get to the altar, and it says, shalosh amot, or 3, so it'd be 3 of these. 3 more of these. 3 amot actually measured, and it would be from the ground. If you know how tall I am, if you've ever stood next to me, it was coming about to my eye level. I used to be 5'5". I'm probably shorter now, but so sometimes just getting a sense, and if you ever have a chance to go through the Temple Institute, a picture's worth 1,000 words sometimes, just to see to scale the size of the altar and so forth, and even in the Mishkan, to understand the difference between the altar of sacrifice and the Mishkan, and the size of it, which was pretty small, and then compare it to the size of the altar in the temple, which was so big the priest could walk around the rim without getting burned. That's how big it was. So we're getting kind of a mini scale when it comes to the Mishkan. And what I noticed is I never paid much attention to how many roofs it had. It has more than one, and like I said, I'll try to go over it with tomorrow's class. But one thing I figured out, just looking, if you just pick something up and say, I'll learn about the tabernacle this way. Well, I picked this up, and they've got it wrong. They've got the altar of incense in the wrong place. So if you learn it wrong the first time, then you remember it wrong the rest of the time. So I wanted to go through, and we can do it with tomorrow's class, and just walk through the tabernacle to try to get a sense of its scale, where it has strange things written, and to even look at the different layers of the roofs and what they were made of, and what, when we get down to here, what was woven into that was so cool, because it goes back to those creatures in Ezekiel. Remember the creatures with the wheels, the 4 living creatures? Never really understood how that was on those curtains, but I think we've got good description that'll help us even see, like on the curtain, how what was on the front was not what was on the back. Which is, it would have to take an artisan to be able to weave that. It wasn't really supposed to be embroidered. According to what they're saying, the embroidery is not the greatest translation. It was actually woven into the fabric itself, which would be an incredible feat. To have this creature on the front, which does not look like this creature on the back. What would they have in common? They would have in common those wings. So let's see, what could I have you do to get you ready for tomorrow? Or basically the walkthrough of the tabernacle would be to read Ezekiel 1, the whole chapter, the first chapter of Ezekiel, because it's going to render out, and it's possible that what Moses saw and what Ezekiel sees in chapter 1 are exactly the same thing, just described in two different ways. That's a possibility. So that's the plan. Tomorrow's class, we'll just kind of walk through the tabernacle itself, maybe open up some things that I don't know what it's talking about there. There was a couple of things that have crowns on them, diadems. There's a belt around the altar that's important because the things that happened above it and the things that happened below it. How the boards were put together with the sockets, that's important, I think. And the measurements, how many times specific numbers pop up, like 50, which is the Hebrew letter nun, and it means propagation or reproduction. All these things come into play somehow in helping us understand what Moses saw, what Ezekiel saw. And like I said, the stuff we got in Sunday school, it wasn't always right. And I'll recommend, because what's in this book is pretty close. I think I showed you this book last year. It's heavy. But I think the good news is, if you can't, I got this from Art Scroll when they had one of their sales. If you'll get on their mailing list, they tend to have their sales around the feasts. And a lot of times they'll send out an email and say, for 3 days, everything's 50% off. And if you've got your wish list ready, a book like this that's pretty expensive, you might be able to get it cheaper, and you might be able to get it used. Check with those. There's websites that have used Jewish books. Amazon will have books up there. eBay will have books up there. And this is worth having, I think. There's one like it on the temple as well. But from what I can tell on these illustrations, I mean, like the bread that's in the Torah portion, look how weird that looks. But this is pretty much right on with Rashi. In terms, and if there's a question, like we're not really sure what that means, they make a notation. But, and I think this was in Temple Institute, if I'm not mistaken. Doesn't really say. I was thinking the Temple Institute had a hand in this. But it's good because it even helps you see, like for the bread, that it had racks so that the air could circulate between the loaves so that they would mold, because they sat there for 6 days. They weren't going to be eaten until Shabbat. It also shows, like, when we're talking about all those sockets in the Torah portion, it'll show you how the beam was made, and then it had legs, and the beams were upright. They weren't horizontal. The beams were vertical. So it would have these legs on the bottom of the vertical beam, and then it would have a socket, a base at the bottom, and so those legs would slip right down into the base, so that when it was all put together, it fit together really nice and tight. And
it looks like an electrical plug.
Uh-oh. It's glue or something. But this is this is a good resource. If you don't have it, it's worth saving up to get it, I think. If you're, especially if you're a visual person and you get halfway through the sockets and the hooks and the so forth, and you get lost, that's where I think you switch over and you read this with your text so that you're still right with it. Because if you're not a building type person, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then it explains, like, the things that I always thought were overlaid with gold. It explains how they were really made. We just thought they were coated with gold, or I did, and they weren't. There's certain things that it was done differently. And there were actually 3 arcs. Did you ever read that? Yeah, there's 3 arcs. They fit like boxes within one another. That's where they were able to make it according to the specifications. So anyway, sorry we took up so much time with the Hebrew, but I thought it was a great opportunity. So if you want to take advantage of that, just shoot me an email and I'll build a list starting with you guys. And then once I have that, I'll announce it to the outside folk. And just plan, if you're going to sign up, just plan on starting on the 17th. Any questions? I know we didn't cover much teaching material, but I don't know if you noticed either. This is Genesis 2. Did you notice? When you start decoding what was in Genesis 2, remember the good gold? Remember the Shoham stone? Remember the Pishon River where the Pishon grew for the flax? We've got the trees in there. Yeah. And I think, depends on how much time we have tomorrow, I'd like to show you how he kind of reverse engineered creation to get us back in that garden in this tabernacle. Because the last thing they saw on their way out was the 2 cherubim, right? Well, as you go back in, the last thing you're going to see is the 2 cherubim. And by the way, I'd love to have, which you guys could probably teach it yourself at this point, but Brad Scott and I are going to do a creation conference up in Cincinnati that first weekend in May. So I'd love to see you guys come in. It's going to be at the airport Marriott, maybe. I'll send out an email eventually. I got a press kit. I just haven't had time to do it this last week. Got a little hectic, but I'm not sure with Brad in creation. He could do anything, but I will probably do a little bit of Genesis 1 and a lot of Genesis 2. And then you can get discounted tickets to the Ark encounter, which is worth doing if you've never done it. It's worth doing once. I don't know. I'd do it twice. The Creation Museum. If you want those tickets added on to the conference, they get them at a discount. And the Creation Museum I wasn't that impressed with, but you can do selfies with dinosaurs and stuff. Let's see. The tabernacle in the shape of a dome. It could have had a partial dome-like appearance once it had all the covers on top. That's one thing you don't really get until you look at a visual, is you've got this, they kept calling it the spread, and you've got the spread with the cherubim woven into it, and then you've got goat hair over that, then you've got ram skin dyed red over that, and then you've got the tachash covering that nobody really knows what that is. They'll guess and say dolphin skins, badger skins. The rabbis say that that particular species does not exist anymore. It was something especially given for the Mishkan, like the little worm that carved out the jewels with the names on them. You have to kind of take some of that with a grain of salt too, because there may actually be a tachash out there somewhere. So it could have had the inner one would have had a specific structure or square rectangle structure. But once you get those outer covers over it, because the dimensions are not the same as the basic structure, once you get those outer covers over it, it may have had more of a rounded appearance. Oh, that's it. Tashunda posted the name of the book in there. The Mishkan, the Tabernacle, its structure, and its sacred vessels. And Art Scroll puts this out.